Alright, so here's more homework on graphing sine and cosine. But this time we have a lot more transformations to think through. Alright, so what's the amplitude here? 2. Is there anything multiplying or dividing inside that would change the period? So it stays 2 pi. The phase shift, we are inversing it. So instead of adding, we're subtracting. So this means horizontal. So it also tells me this is where my graph is starting. Vertical shift, there is none because there's no adding or subtracting at the end. And the midline, is there anything that would shift that midline? And the midline would not. So the midline would stay at 0. That's the middle of my wave. Alright, so let's start graphing. Where's negative pi? Cosine starts at the top. So at negative pi, we're going to start at the top. Then the period is 2 pi. So I'm going to add 2 pi to negative pi. So what's negative 1 plus 2 takes me to pi, and that's the end of one cycle. In the middle between that, we'll go to the bottom of the wave, and then the middle between those would be the middle, which is at 0. And there is one cycle. So I'm going to continue that cycle. And follow the pattern. Be a good pattern follower. It goes up, it goes down. It goes up, it goes down. And if you find something's breaking the pattern, then something mathematically went wrong. Alright, number 2. The amplitude is 1. The period is 2 pi. There is no phase shift. And we have a vertical shift of 4, which means now the midline is at y equals 4. Sine starts in the middle at 0 because there's no phase shift. But our middle now is not at 0 but at 4. So there is now the middle of my wave. So I start at 0 but I go to 4 because that's now the middle of my wave. The period is 2 pi. And in the middle of those you have middle, middle, middle. Now the first two, since sine is positive, it goes to the maximum. So I go up 1. And then I go in the middle and I go down 1. And that's the pattern of one cycle. So to negative 2 pi and to negative pi. And on this side it goes down 1. And then from the middle it goes up 1. And that's it. Number 3. The amplitude, none. The period would be pi, but do you see something's multiplying? So I divide it by 2. The phase shift, to undo what's inside the parentheses, I add 3 pi over 4. And that tells me where I'm starting. There is no vertical shift, so that means the midline is y equals 0. And in this case, the midline would give me my point of inflection. So can you find 3 pi over 4 and 0? Next, the period is pi over 2. So from 3 pi over 4, I have to add pi to understand where that's going to end. So if I get common denominators, I get 7 pi over 4. Now, every square is 1 pi over 4. So think of this as 4 over 4, 5 over 4, 6 over 4, 7 over 4. So that's where it begins and ends. Exactly in the middle between that is an asymptote, and I have my pattern. Oh, whoa. Sorry, what's my period? It was pi over 2. So let's try this again. So we have 3 pi over 4, and we add pi over 2 to that and get common denominators. And that gives me 5 pi over 4. Silly me. So 5 pi over 4 is actually right here. I just have to change where my asymptote is. No asymptote. use my handy eraser here. All right, let's go. Let's see if I can go from here. So follow the pattern. Now, in between the point of inflection and the asymptote, this times 2 in front will just stretch up that second point we need to curve it. So when I look here, take a point of inflection here. Instead of at 1, it would be 2 in the middle. Instead of -1, it'd be -2. And then that pattern just continues. All right, number 4. So this does have an amplitude. It's 1. The period would be 2 pi. But notice inside, to undo that, I multiply it times 2, so it's 4 pi. Adding or subtracting inside, I do the inverse, so I'm adding pi over 2. And there is a vertical shift of -1, so it's going to go 1 down, so there's my midline. Cosine starts at the maximum. And so I need to see where that maximum is. So first of all, the phase shift is pi over 2. Let's find where pi over 2 is. And then normally, our maximum would be at 1, but everything has been shifted down 1. So instead of at +1, the maximum now is actually at 0. So it would be at +1, but this subtract 1 brings it down 1. So there's my maximum. My period is 4 pi. I can't do it. But if I go from where I started, pi over 2 plus 4 pi, that would have, with common denominators, that's 1/8. That's 9 pi over 2. That would have ended it. So half of that is where I'm looking at. So 9 pi over 2, what's half of 9 pi over 2? That's 9 pi over 4. So at 9 pi over 4, the cycle is going to end. So luckily, each square here is 1 pi over 4. So already at 2. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Here is actually going to be the middle of my wave. Done. So that's going to be the bottom. Now normally my bottom would be at -1, but everything is going down 1. So instead of -1, it goes down to -2. So we're going to follow that pattern on the other side and even count the squares. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? 7 squares. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then down to -2. So there's the pattern right there. Now in the middle, so because we counted 7, it's 3.5. So 1, 2, 3, 3.5 would be in the middle. So 1, 2, 3.5 would be in the middle. 1, 2, 3.5 would be in the middle. And our middle is at -1. And then that's the wave we draw. Number 5. The amplitude here is 1. The period would be 2 pi, but I'm going to go the inverse of that. So that's 3/4. So 2 makes the 4 into a 2, so it's 3 pi over 2. The phase shift is negative 3 pi over 2. That's where I'm going to start. The vertical shift is up 2. That means y equals 2 is the midline. All right, so sine starts in the middle. So at negative 3 pi over 2, which is negative 1.5, I need to start at 2. So that's where I'm going to start, and that's the middle of my wave. Now, my period is 3 pi over 2. So negative 3 pi over 2 plus 3 pi over 2, that's 0. So at 0 is also going to be the middle of my wave. And then in the middle between those, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so 3, following the pattern, that's also going to be in the middle. Now we started here, the first 2 in the middle is going to go to the top. And so we're going to go up 1 for that, because that's the amplitude. And then in the middle here, we're going to go down. And there's the pattern. That's one cycle. So let's count it out. 1, 2, 3, right? So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And then in the middle, up. And then in the middle, down 1. 1, 2, 3, middle up. 1, 2, 3, middle down. And there's your wave. And you've drawn it. Number 6, amplitude is 1.5. The period would be 2 pi, but it's times 3 over 2. The 2's divide out, leaves me with 3 pi. The phase shift is positive pi over 4. There is no vertical shift, so the midline is at 0. Cosine starts at the top, or the bottom. In this case, it starts at the top. So the phase shift's at pi over 4, and then I go to the top, which is 1.5. From pi over 4, I'm going to add the period to it, which is 3 pi. I need common denominators. So that's 13 pi over 4. Now, I'm not going to be able to count that far, I think. Maybe that's 13 pi, right? That's 13 pi. So the very end here, let's see, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I'm not going to be able to count to 13. So I need to know what half of that is. So half of that's 13 pi over 8. To be able to understand it. I can go actually in this direction. So maybe I can go in that direction to complete one cycle. So again, the period is 3 pi. So 1.5 pi will get me in the middle. So let's make it simple. So 1.5 pi is 6 squares. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That gets us to the middle, which is actually our bottom of the wave, which is at negative 1.5. In the middle between those, which is here at pi, the midline is at 0. So there's the pattern I'm going to follow. 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3, it's in the middle. 1, 2, 3, it's at the bottom. 1, 2, 3, it's at the middle again. Number 7, no amplitude. The period would be pi, but it's times 3, so it's 3 pi. The phase shift's negative pi. We have a vertical shift up 1, so now our POI is at that midline y equals 1. So at negative pi, I'm going to start here at 1. So negative pi, it's at 1. The phase shift is 3 pi. So if I go negative 3 pi plus 3 pi, the cycle ends at 2 pi. So at 2 pi, that's when it ends. And then exactly in the middle between them, will be an asymptote. So there's my pattern. Now, exactly in the middle between the asymptote and the point of inflection, it's going to go up to 3. So from here, you go up 3. 1, 2, 3. Oh, here, start with, I'm starting at negative pi. So 1, 2, 3. And then exactly in the middle, I'm going to go up 3. 1, 2, 3. So it's going to curve there and go 1, 2, 3 left, and then 3 down. And you have those points that you need. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 down. And there it is. And this one's going to go up in that direction. All right, 2 more. Cosine, it's positive 2. The 2 in front there, divide by 2 makes it pi. The phase shift, negative 5 pi over 4. And then the vertical shift is up 3. So there's our midline. So where's the phase shift? Find negative 5 pi over 4. It's going to start at the bottom. Now the bottom would be at negative 2, but we're going up 3 with everything. So our bottom of our wave now is 1. So can I find negative 5 pi over 4 and positive 1? Then, to the phase shift, I'm going to add the period, which is pi. I need common denominators. So that gives me negative 1 pi over 4. So negative 1 pi over 4 is also the bottom of my wave. In the middle between them will be the maximum of my wave. Now that's going to be 2 plus 3, which is 5. That's going to be the top of my wave. And then in the middle between those are going to be the midlines, which is at 3. So there is one cycle. And once I see the pattern, I repeat the pattern. And it's done. All right, last one. Tangent doesn't have an amplitude. The period is pi, but it's times 3 over 2, so it's 3 pi over 2 is 1 period. The phase shift is positive pi over 2. The vertical shift is down 1, which means the midline now is at negative 1. Okay, so the phase shift at pi over 2. So I find pi over 2, and I go down to negative 1. There's my point of inflection. To pi over 2, I'm going to add 3 pi over 2. That's easy because the denominators are the same. That's 4 over 2 or 2 pi. So there ends my cycle. Exactly in the middle between them is going to be a point asymptote. And that's the pattern I'm going to follow. Now, to find the secondary points, it would normally be positive 1 and negative 1, but in this case it's positive 4. You multiply it. So exactly in the middle, and then go up 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Exactly in the middle, and go down 1, 2, 3, 4. So exactly in the middle. Exactly in the middle, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. Good job being a pattern follower, pattern power. And good job doing your homework. Mr. G Math, over now.